The school was known for its excellence, its high standards, and its unwavering commitment to success. It stood tall and proud in the heart of the city, its towering walls and grand architecture a testament to decades of prestigious education. Every year, students from across the country sought to enter, hoping to be part of a legacy that promised nothing but the best. At the center of it all was the principal, a man whose reputation was as polished as the school itself. For years, the principal had been a guiding force, leading the school with a firm hand. He was the product of a world where only the best were deemed worthy of success, where qualifications and elite pedigrees were the ticket to greatness. To him, success meant order, structure, and control. Every decision he made was calculated, every policy carefully crafted to ensure that the school remained at the top of its game. But in the midst of all this, something unexpected happened. It began with a simple announcement, a routine update about the school's computer system, which handled everything from student records to grades. The system had been upgraded recently, and everything seemed fine. Until one morning the unthinkable occurred. The school's computer system crashed. It wasn't just a minor glitch or a temporary issue. The entire network went down, and with it the heart of the school's operations. The principal, who had always prided himself on maintaining control, was now faced with a problem he couldn't solve. For hours the IT team scrambled, trying to find the cause of the crash, but nothing worked. The system remained offline, and as the hours turned into a day and then into a second day, the principal's frustration grew. The school was in chaos. Without the system, the staff couldn't access student records, exam results were inaccessible, and teachers were left in the dark about their lesson plans. Parents started calling, demanding answers. Students began to panic, unsure if their academic progress was in jeopardy. The principal, a man who had once been confident in his ability to handle any challenge, was now unsure of what to do. He called in experts from outside the school, hoping they could fix the problem. They arrived with their laptops, their expensive equipment, and their promises to get the system back online. But the hours turned into days, and still, the system refused to function. The principal's sense of control, his belief that he could fix any problem, began to slip away. He had always been the one with all the answers, the one who knew how to navigate even the most difficult situations. But now, standing helplessly by as the school continued to fall apart, he began to wonder if this time, the problem was beyond his reach. It wasn't just about the system anymore. It was about his reputation. The elite principal, whose name had been synonymous with success, now found himself at a crossroads. What would happen if the system couldn't be fixed? What would happen if this was the beginning of the school's decline? The question swirled in his mind, and with every passing minute, the weight of the situation grew heavier. The teachers were frustrated. Some of them tried to continue their lessons using outdated materials and methods, but it wasn't the same. They couldn't access the information they needed, and students struggled to keep up. The parents, too, were becoming restless. They wanted answers, and they wanted them fast. Amid the chaos, the principal tried to remain calm, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. His usual confidence, which had once been unshakable, was gone. He couldn't fix the problem. He couldn't make the system work. For the first time in years, he felt out of control. In the principal's office, the phone rang constantly. It was a constant reminder of his failure. He answered one call after another, giving the same update, that they were still working on the problem, but there was no solution yet. The words felt empty in his mouth. He had no answers, no reassurances to offer. As the days wore on, the stress took its toll. The principal barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of what might happen next. He wondered if the school, once the crown jewel of the city's education system, could ever recover from this setback. Could it survive without its system? Would the parents pull their children out? Would the school lose its status? And, perhaps most importantly, what would people think of him? The man who had always been the one to solve every problem was now powerless, in the face of a technological failure. It was during one of these sleepless nights that he heard something strange. A quiet voice coming from outside his office. He paused, wondering if he had imagined it. Then it came again. A voice, soft but persistent, calling out from the hallway. Curious, the principal stepped out of his office. To his surprise, he saw a young man standing at the door. He didn't recognize him. The boy looked out of place. not dressed in the usual uniforms or attire expected of the students or staff. He was the son of the school's janitor, someone who had always kept to himself, a quiet figure who worked diligently behind the scenes. The principal raised an eyebrow, unsure of what to expect. The young man with his shy demeanor and unassuming presence approached him. He wasn't the type of person the principal would normally seek out for help, but something about the situation made him pause. "I might be able to help with the system," the young man said quietly. The principal stared at him, stunned. "You? How do you know anything about technology?" The young man hesitated but then spoke with quiet confidence. "I don't have formal training, sir, but I've worked with computers at home. I fix things when they break. I think I can help." The principal, taken aback, almost dismissed the idea. How could someone with no credentials, no qualifications, possibly fix a system as complex as this? But in that moment, as he stood there in the hallway surrounded by the silence of the broken system, something shifted. The principal was desperate. And for the first time in a long while, he realized that perhaps the solution to his problem wouldn't come from the places he had always trusted. The principal stood still for a moment, still processing the young man's words. He had always prided himself on making decisions with a clear mind, relying on his vast experience and knowledge. But now, with everything falling apart around him, he realized he had no choice but to take a leap of faith. "All right," the principal said, his voice firm but tinged with uncertainty. "If you think you can help, then go ahead. But know that the pressure is immense. The whole school is counting on this system being fixed. It's not just a matter of restoring data. It's about keeping the reputation of the school intact." The young man nodded quietly, not seeming to be fazed by the weight of the task ahead of him. The principal was accustomed to seeing confidence in the eyes of those who had been trained at the finest institutions. But this young man, a janitor's son, with no formal training or credentials, appeared calm, unbothered, and even more importantly, determined. "Thank you," the young man said simply. Before turning to walk toward the server room, the principal followed him, still unsure of what to expect. The server room was located in the back of the building, hidden away from the eyes of most students and staff. It was a place where only the most trusted IT staff ever ventured. And yet, here was a young man, a stranger in many ways, about to step into that space. As they arrived at the server room, the principal stood at the door, watching the young man carefully. The room was cool, with rows of machines lined up against the walls. They hummed with an eerie, almost mechanical rhythm. The young man walked over to the main console, his eyes scanning the screens with an intensity that made the principal uneasy. He had never seen someone look at technology in such a way. It was as if the young man wasn't just looking at machines but trying to understand them on a deeper level. "Do you know what's wrong with the system?" the principal asked, his voice laced with hesitation. The young man nodded without looking away from the screens. "I think so. The server's having trouble communicating with the main system. It's a software issue, but it's been complicated by a hardware malfunction. It's not easy to fix, but it's not impossible either." The principal couldn't help but feel a twinge of disbelief. How could someone with no formal qualifications be so certain? And yet, the young man spoke with such calm assurance that the principal felt a flicker of hope, a hope he hadn't allowed himself to feel in days. The young man sat down at the console, his fingers flying across the keyboard with ease. The principal watched in silence, still unsure of what to make of this situation. He was used to experts, used to people who had spent years studying, who had the credentials to back up their claims. But this young man had none of that. He had no credentials, no formal education in technology, and yet here he was, doing something the so-called experts had failed to do. Minutes passed, then hours. The principal paced nervously outside the server room, his mind racing. He tried to remain calm, but the pressure was mounting. The staff was growing restless, the parents were demanding answers, and the students were starting to panic. He couldn't afford for this young man to fail. If the system wasn't restored soon, the school's reputation would be in jeopardy, and with it, the principal's career. As the sun began to set, the principal walked back to the server room, peeking inside. The young man was still working, his face illuminated by the glow of the screens. The only sound in the room was the steady clicking of the keyboard and the hum of the machines. It was as if time had stopped. "How are you doing?" the principal asked, his voice quieter than before. The young man paused for a moment, then looked up. His expression was one of quiet determination. "I think I've found the issue," he said, his voice calm. "It's a simple fix, really. The software is corrupt, but once I get it back up and running, the system should work fine again. The hardware needs a little tweaking, but nothing we can't handle." The principal's heart skipped a beat. Could it really be that simple? Could this young man actually fix what had seemed so impossible? The principal could hardly believe it. And yet something told him this wasn't just luck. The young man was doing what no one else had been able to do, and he was doing it with a quiet confidence that spoke volumes. The principal stayed silent for a moment, watching the young man work. For the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps he had been wrong. Perhaps success didn't always come from the places he expected. Maybe it wasn't about credentials or status at all. Maybe it was about something else, something more human. After what seemed like an eternity, the young man stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans. He turned to the principal, his eyes still focused but now filled with a quiet pride. "It's done," he said. The principal couldn't hide his astonishment. The system was back online. Everything that had been lost, the records, the grades, the schedules, had been restored. The servers hummed back to life and the screens flickered with data once again. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The principal stood there, staring at the screen in disbelief. The system had been fixed. The school was saved. The young man, sensing the principal's shock, quietly packed up his things and began to leave the room. But the principal stopped him. "Wait," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "Thank you. I don't know how you did it, but you saved this school. You saved everything." The young man simply nodded. "I just did what needed to be done," he said, his voice still humble. "I'm glad I could help." The principal watched as the young man walked out of the server room. He couldn't quite put into words the feeling he had. It wasn't just relief. It was something deeper. This young man, with no formal education or training, had done something the so-called experts hadn't been able to do. He had saved the school, not with his credentials, but with his determination and resourcefulness. As the young man disappeared down the hallway, the principal stood in the server room, looking at the glowing screens. He couldn't help but wonder how many other people like this young man there were. People with talent and potential, but no formal recognition. People who didn't fit the mold of what he had always believed success looked like. And for the first time in his career, the principal began to realize that maybe he had been wrong all along. The principal spent the next few days in a state of quiet reflection. The school had returned to normal thanks to the young man who had fixed the system. The students resumed their lessons and the teachers went back to their routines. But there was a shift in the air. The principal, once known for his strict adherence to standards and protocol, began to look at things differently. He couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The young man had stepped in and fixed the system when no one else could, not because of any prestigious degree or years of formal training, but because of his sheer determination, resourcefulness, and willingness to solve a problem no one else could. The principal couldn't ignore the lessons that had emerged from the whole ordeal. Lessons about humility, about the importance of seeing potential in unexpected places, and about what it really meant to lead. The young man had left the server room that day without asking for anything in return. He hadn't wanted praise or recognition, just the satisfaction of solving a problem. It was a quality the principal hadn't seen in many people, especially in his line of work, where ambition and self-promotion often went hand in hand with success. But this young man was different. He had come from humble beginnings, yet he possessed a humility the principal couldn't quite understand. For the first time in years, the principal started to question his approach. He had always valued credentials, degrees, and titles, things that were easy to measure, easy to compare. But the events of the past few days had forced him to confront the idea that maybe those things weren't the best indicators of a person's worth. Maybe there was more to success than just qualifications and prestige. The young man had restored the system and, in doing so, had restored the principal's faith in something more important, the potential of people. Regardless of their background, the principal decided to find the young man again to thank him properly for his work. But when he went to the janitor's office, he wasn't there. The principal learned that the young man hadn't returned to work since the day the system had been fixed. He asked around, hoping to track him down, but no one seemed to know where he had gone. It was as though he had vanished. Days turned into weeks, and the principal continued to feel a gnawing sense of guilt. He knew he needed to acknowledge the young man's contribution, but he didn't know how to find him. It wasn't just about gratitude anymore. It was about understanding the lessons he had learned. The young man had taught him something far more important than just technical skills. He had taught him what it meant to truly lead with humility and to recognize the hidden potential in people who were often overlooked. Then one afternoon, the principal was walking through the school grounds when he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. There, sitting on a bench in the courtyard, was the young man. He was reading a book, completely unaware of the principal approaching. The principal couldn't believe his eyes. There he was, as though nothing had ever happened, as though the entire world hadn't been turned upside down by the crash of the system. The principal took a deep breath and walked over to him. The young man looked up in surprise, but his face broke into a small, respectful smile when he saw who it was. "I've been looking for you," the principal said, his voice sincere. "I wanted to thank you properly for everything you did." The young man looked down at the book in his hands, his expression softening. "It was nothing, really. I just did what I could." The principal shook his head. "It was more than that. You saved this school. You restored something that no one else could. You taught me something in the process. Something that's made me realize just how wrong I've been about what it means to succeed." The young man's smile faded a little, but he still didn't say anything. "Can I ask you something?" the principal continued, his curiosity getting the best of him. "Why didn't you tell me about your skills? Why didn't you let anyone know what you could do?" The young man looked up at the sky for a moment, then answered quietly, "I've never been the type to seek attention. My father always taught me that it's not about getting noticed or praised, but about doing the right thing. I just wanted to help. I didn't want anything else." The principal was stunned. He had expected an answer perhaps, but not one that carried such weight. This young man, with so much talent and humility, had never sought recognition for his work. He had simply wanted to make a difference, to fix a problem, and to do what was right. The principal stood there in silence, taking in the words. He had spent his entire career chasing success and prestige, always seeking the admiration of others. But here was someone who had never cared for any of that. Someone who had demonstrated true leadership by simply doing what needed to be done. The principal sat down beside the young man, still in awe of his humility and the lessons he had learned. "I've spent so much time focusing on titles, on what people have achieved on paper. I thought that was the only way to measure success. But you've shown me that there's more to it than that. Success is about the impact you have, about helping others, about doing things for the right reasons." The young man didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded, as if he understood that the principal had come to an important realization. There was a quiet peace between them, a shared understanding that spoke volumes without needing words. "I want to help you," the principal said after a while, breaking the silence. "I don't know what your plans are, but I want to offer you something. A scholarship, perhaps, or an opportunity to develop your skills further. You've got potential, and I want to help you reach it." The young man looked at him, his expression unreadable. "I appreciate that, sir. But I don't need a scholarship. I'm happy where I am. My goal isn't to climb any ladder or get recognition. I just want to keep learning and doing what I can to help." The principal sat back, realizing that this young man was exactly what he needed to become. Someone who didn't seek validation, but instead focused on making a real difference in the world. The principal had spent so much time trying to build his legacy, but now he realized that a true legacy was built not on titles or awards, but on the positive impact you had on the lives of others. "I understand," the principal said quietly, "and I respect that. But know this, you've already made a bigger impact than most people will ever make. You've already changed the way I see things." The young man gave him a small, appreciative smile. "Thank you, sir. That means more to me than you know." As the principal left the courtyard, he couldn't help but feel a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the young man, but for the lessons he had learned. His whole perspective on success had changed. He now understood that leadership wasn't about being in charge or having the most prestigious titles. It was about doing what was right, helping others, and recognizing the potential in people no one else might see. And for the first time in a long while, the principal felt like he was on the path to becoming the kind of leader who would inspire others, not through his credentials or power, but through his ability to see the value in everyone around him. As weeks went by, the principal found himself reflecting on everything that had happened, the young man's actions. His quiet humility and his ability to solve problems that no one else could had changed the principal's perspective in ways he couldn't quite explain. He had come to realize that leadership wasn't just about being in charge or having all the answers. It was about making a real difference in people's lives, regardless of status, title, or background. But even with the lessons he had learned, something still bothered the principal. The young man had fixed the system and left without asking for anything in return. He had refused any recognition, any reward. It was almost as if he didn't care about what came next. And the more the principal thought about it, the more he realized that the young man's actions were not just about fixing a computer system. They were about something deeper. It was about taking ownership of something, doing the right thing and not expecting anything in return. The principal knew that he had to find a way to make things right. He couldn't let the young man slip away without acknowledging the impact he had made on the school, and more importantly, on him. The school had returned to normal, but the principal felt a deeper sense of gratitude that hadn't yet been fully expressed. One afternoon, after a particularly long meeting, the principal was walking through the hallways when he saw something that made him stop. A group of students were gathered around the young man. They weren't just talking to him. They were listening to him, hanging on his every word. The young man was explaining something, probably about technology, the way he had restored the school system, and the students were fascinated by him. They weren't just interested in what he knew. They were interested in him as a person. It was clear that they respected him, but even more, they looked up to him. The principal couldn't help but stand there watching. He saw the young man's natural ability to teach, to inspire, to captivate. It was a gift he had never seen in many of the school's so-called experts, those who had degrees, prestigious titles, and years of formal training. But this young man, who had no formal education in technology, had done something even more remarkable. He had engaged the students on a personal level. He had made them feel like they were part of something important. They weren't just learning about computers. They were learning about how to approach problems, how to think critically, and how to face challenges head-on. The principal continued to watch, mesmerized. He had been so focused on credentials, titles, and appearances for so long that he had failed to see what really mattered: the ability to connect with others, to inspire them, to make them feel empowered. That was the kind of leadership the school needed. Not the kind of leadership that came with a fancy degree or a prestigious background, but the kind that came from understanding, empathy, and a willingness to help others. He waited until the students dispersed, and then he approached the young man. This time there was no hesitation in his steps. The principal knew exactly what he had to do. "I've been thinking a lot," the principal said, his voice steady but full of sincerity, "about everything that happened with the system, and about you." The young man looked up, surprised but not startled. "There's no need to thank me again, sir. I did what I could." "I'm not thanking you," the principal said quickly. "I've learned something from you. Something that I never understood before. I've spent so much time focusing on titles, on success that's measured by degrees and achievements. But you've shown me that there's more to leadership than just those things. It's about making a difference, about connecting with people, not because of your qualifications, but because of who you are and what you bring to the table." The young man listened quietly, not interrupting. The principal could see that he wasn't seeking praise, wasn't waiting for acknowledgement. He had always been humble, always acted with purpose. But the principal needed to say it anyway. "I want to offer you something," the principal continued. "I want to offer you the opportunity to study, to learn more about technology, to get the education you deserve. I believe you have potential, and I want to help you reach it. I don't want to lose someone like you because you didn't have the chance to pursue something bigger." The young man shook his head, his expression soft but firm. "I appreciate the offer, sir, but I'm not looking for that. I'm not after recognition or titles. I don't need a degree to know what I can do. What I need is to keep learning and keep helping people. That's enough for me." The principal was silent for a moment. He knew that what the young man was saying was true. The young man wasn't interested in accolades or the typical path to success. He had already proven that he didn't need those things to make a real impact. The principal could see the determination in his eyes, not the kind of determination that came from a desire for personal gain, but the kind that came from a place of genuine care and purpose. "You're right," The principal finally said. You've already made a difference. More of a difference than most people with degrees and titles will ever make. The young man smiled faintly, but it was clear that he wasn't looking for approval. He wasn't interested in being recognized or praised. He had done what he had done because it was the right thing to do, and that was all that mattered. I just want to keep doing what I'm doing, the young man said. I don't need anything more than that. The principal stood there, taking in the young man's words. For so long he had measured success by what could be quantified, by degrees, by titles, by the things people could show to prove their worth. But in front of him stood someone who had taught him that true success couldn't always be measured. It was about the impact you had on others, about the quiet moments of making a difference when no one was watching. The young man didn't need a degree to prove his worth. His worth was already clear in the way he had helped, in the way he had quietly led without ever asking for recognition. The principal took a deep breath, feeling a deep sense of gratitude wash over him. You've changed me, he said quietly. You've shown me what true leadership looks like. The young man didn't say anything in response, but his eyes softened. It was clear that he didn't need words of praise. He was content knowing that he had done what was right, that he had helped when help was needed. The principal turned to leave, but before he walked away, he looked back at the young man one more time. This time, he wasn't just looking at a problem solver or a student. He was looking at someone who had changed the way he saw the world. Someone who had proven that success wasn't about what you had, but about what you gave. The principal had spent weeks reflecting on everything that had transpired since the day the system crashed. The young man had changed his life in ways he couldn't have anticipated. He had shown him the true meaning of leadership, of impact, and of what it really meant to make a difference. The principal had spent so much time in his career chasing credentials, achievements, and titles, believing those were the markers of success. But the young man had taught him something far more important, that true leadership comes from humility, from understanding, and from a genuine desire to help others. The principal had made it his mission to ensure that the school was never the same again. He couldn't go back to the way things were. He knew that the lessons he had learned from the young man couldn't just stay with him. They had to be shared with others. The school had to become a place that valued not just credentials and titles, but the true potential in every person, no matter their background, no matter their social standing. With that in mind, the principal began making changes. He started to look at students, teachers, and staff differently. No longer was he focused solely on their achievements on paper. Instead, he focused on their character, their ability to think critically, to solve problems, and to work together. He began to emphasize the importance of collaboration, the power of creative thinking, and the value of helping one another. He saw potential in places he had never looked before, and he encouraged others to do the same. The young man's actions had inspired something greater than just the restoration of a computer system. They had sparked a shift in the entire school culture. The principal knew that real change started with him, but it wouldn't end there. He had to foster an environment where everyone could thrive, where people were valued not for their titles, but for their willingness to make a difference. A few months later, the principal stood before the entire staff at a meeting. He had called them together to share some important news. The room quieted as he stepped up to the front, feeling the weight of the moment. He had always been a man of authority, but now he felt like a man on the verge of something new. His speech would be unlike any he had given before. Thank you all for coming today, the principal began, his voice steady but filled with a new sense of purpose. I have something important I want to share with you all. As many of you know, we've been through some difficult times recently. The crash of our system was more than just a technical issue. It was a wake-up call, and I've realized that it wasn't just the system that needed fixing. It was the way we've been thinking about success and leadership. The staff listened intently, a few of them exchanging curious glances. They had known the principal as someone who valued structure, achievement, and tradition. But now, there was something different in his tone. For years, he continued, I've believed that success was defined by titles, by degrees, by the credentials that people carry with them. I've placed more value on what can be measured on paper than on the qualities that truly matter. Qualities like creativity, resourcefulness, and the ability to work together to solve problems. But I've come to realize that those things, those human qualities, are what truly make a difference. We've been measuring success the wrong way." There was a murmur in the room, a ripple of surprise. The principal could see the staff absorbing his words. He continued, "I want us to change how we view success. I want us to look beyond the surface to see the potential in everyone, in our students, in each other. We need to recognize that leadership is not about titles or authority. It's about serving others, about being willing to step up and do what's necessary no matter who you are or where you come from." The principal paused, letting the words sink in. "And I want to thank someone for helping me realize this. It's someone who doesn't have a degree in computer science, who doesn't have a prestigious title. He's someone who taught me the true meaning of leadership through action, not words. The young man who fixed our system when no one else could. He showed me that leadership is not about recognition, but about making a difference when it matters most." The room fell silent, the staff now fully engaged. The principal's voice grew stronger, more passionate as he spoke. "I know many of you have worked hard to get where you are, but I want us to create a place where hard work is valued, not just for the degree it gets you or the title you hold, but for the difference you make. I want our students to see that they don't have to follow the traditional path to success. They don't have to have the perfect resume to make an impact." The principal took a deep breath and looked around the room. "And I want to make sure that no one in this school feels like they don't have a place, that they can't contribute because they don't fit a certain mold. We are a community, and we are stronger when we support each other, when we recognize that everyone has something to offer." As the meeting concluded, the principal felt a sense of calm settle over him. He knew that the changes he had just introduced wouldn't happen overnight, but he was certain that they were the right steps. The school, which had once been a place where titles and achievements were everything, was now becoming a place where real human potential was recognized and nurtured. He had learned that it wasn't about credentials or what could be measured, but about the impact people could have when they were given the chance to show their worth. The next day, the young man returned to the school. He had been away for a while, busy with other projects, but the principal had asked him to come in for a special meeting. When the young man walked into the principal's office, the principal stood up, feeling a sense of gratitude wash over him. "I've been thinking a lot about what you taught me," the principal said, his voice filled with sincerity. "And I want to thank you again for everything you did. But I also want to tell you something. What you did, fixing that system, stepping in when no one else could, it changed this school. It changed me. And I want to make sure that we never forget the lessons you taught us." The young man smiled, but it was a quiet, humble smile. "I just did what I had to do. I didn't expect anything in return." The principal nodded. "And that's why you're the kind of leader we need here. You didn't do it for recognition. You did it because it was the right thing to do. And that's what I want to foster here. That kind of leadership." The young man looked at him for a long moment as if weighing his words. "I'm glad to have helped. And I'm glad to see that the school is changing. But you've got to make sure the change sticks. It's not about offering a scholarship or a title. It's about creating a place where everyone feels valued, where everyone can contribute." The principal took the young man's words to heart. He knew that this was just the beginning of something new for the school. It would take time, but the foundation had been laid, and as he looked out of his office window, watching the students and staff move through the halls, he knew that the change was real. The school had learned that leadership was not about titles or recognition. It was about the difference you could make, the impact you could have, and the way you could inspire others to reach their full potential. The principal had learned that the real measure of success wasn't found in degrees or resumes, but in the human connections that were built through shared effort, understanding, and care. And as he walked back into his office, he felt a sense of pride, not for what he had accomplished, but for the lessons he had learned and the changes he had inspired. It was the kind of pride that came from knowing that he had helped create a place where everyone, regardless of their background or their titles, could make a difference. As the weeks passed, the changes in the school began to take root. The principal had kept his promise to reshape the environment, and what had once been a place where success was defined by titles and achievements had transformed into a community centered on collaboration, creativity, and the recognition of every individual's potential. Teachers and students alike began to notice the difference. The staff felt more connected, more united in their shared goal of helping each student thrive. They worked together in ways they never had before, not out of a sense of duty or obligation, but because they now understood that success wasn't just about delivering lessons or following the curriculum. It was about making a real, lasting impact on the lives of the students they served. The students, too, began to change. They were encouraged to think critically, to ask questions, and to see their own potential. For the first time, they understood that success wasn't determined by grades alone, but by their ability to work with others, solve problems, and be creative in the face of challenges. The young man who had fixed the system was now a quiet figure of inspiration. Though he never sought attention or recognition, his presence and actions had left an indelible mark on the school. Word spread quickly about the transformation. Parents who had once been worried about the school's future now saw it in a new light. They saw how their children were more engaged, more willing to take risks, and more excited to learn. They saw how the staff was working together in ways that had never happened before, and how the principal was leading not from a place of authority, but from a place of understanding and empathy. One afternoon, as the principal walked through the school's halls, he was approached by a teacher who had been with the school for many years. She had always been someone who followed the rules, who respected tradition and structure, but lately, something about her had changed. She looked at the principal with a sense of quiet gratitude. "I've been meaning to talk to you," she said, her voice warm but sincere. "I know this isn't something that everyone understands, but I need to thank you. You've shown us something that I don't think we were ready to see. You've reminded us that teaching isn't just about the subjects we teach. It's about the kind of people we're helping our students become." The principal smiled softly, feeling a sense of pride he hadn't felt in years. "I didn't do it alone. It's about all of us working together. It's about recognizing that leadership isn't just about authority. It's about understanding, about making people feel valued." The teacher nodded, her eyes reflecting the sincerity of her words. "I've always believed that education was important, but now I realize that what's more important is helping our students believe in themselves, and I think we're finally starting to do that." As the days turned into months, the principal saw the school become something more than just a place of learning. It was a place of community, of shared purpose, and of growth. The young man who had fixed the system continued his quiet work behind the scenes, helping with whatever was needed. He never sought praise or recognition, but everyone around him could see that he had become a symbol of the school's transformation. His willingness to help, his humility, and his quiet leadership had inspired not just the principal, but an entire community. One day, as the school year drew to a close, the principal invited the young man to a gathering of staff and students. It wasn't a formal event. In fact, the principal had deliberately kept it simple. It was a small gathering to reflect on everything that had happened over the course of the year and to acknowledge the contributions of everyone involved in the school's transformation. The young man entered the room, and for the first time, the principal saw him through the eyes of everyone else. There was no fanfare, no applause, no grand gestures. The young man wasn't looking for recognition. He simply sat down quietly among the others. His humble presence felt more than anything else. The principal stood before the group, his voice steady as he began to speak. "This year has been one of incredible change, not just in our school, but in how we think about success and leadership. We've learned that true leadership isn't about titles or degrees. It's about action. It's about making a difference no matter who you are or where you come from, and it's about the impact we have on one another." He turned to the young man. "There's someone here today who has exemplified everything we've learned this year. Someone who stepped in when the system failed. Someone who showed us that real leadership comes from humility, not from power or recognition." The room was silent, but there was a quiet understanding that filled the air. The young man, though he remained as humble as ever, looked around at the staff and students, his expression soft and reserved. He had never wanted to be the center of attention, but the principal knew that this moment, though brief, was a way for the entire school to recognize what he had done. It wasn't about glorifying the individual. It was about acknowledging the impact one person could have on an entire community. The principal continued, "I want to thank you truly for everything you've done. You've shown us the importance of quiet strength, of working behind the scenes, and of helping others without expecting anything in return. You've made a lasting impact on this school, and I can't thank you enough for that." The young man simply nodded, a small, humble smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He didn't need praise, but the principal knew that this was the right thing to do, to acknowledge the lessons that had been learned, to honor the quiet leadership that had inspired so many. As the gathering came to an end, the principal felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He knew that the school had been forever changed, and that the lessons of humility, leadership, and community would continue to echo long after the young man had gone. The school was no longer just a place where success was defined by what people could show on paper. It was a place where everyone could feel valued, where every individual's potential was recognized. And as the young man quietly left the room, the principal couldn't help but think that in the end, the young man had done more than just fix a broken system. He had helped fix something even more important: the way the school viewed success, leadership, and the power of people to make a real difference.